How expensive has it become to visit Singapore for business? Singapore's MICE or business tourism sector has continued to show strong signs of recovery and it remains key to our tourism growth strategy. But how fast has expenditure, typically seen amongst business travelers, risen here? In fact, which are the most expensive business destinations? Not only in Asia, but across the globe. Let's find out with Lee Quane, Regional Director for Asia for ECA International, as we look closely at ECA International's latest daily rate study, which shows that Singapore last year beat Tokyo in the rankings of the most expensive business destinations in Asia. Let's see where it placed precisely. Good morning, Lee.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Good to speak with you. So, first up, help us understand for business travelers how expensive is it really to visit Singapore for business, and how do we rate globally and also within Asia?
So, based on our most recent study, which was undertaken towards the end of 2022, the current cost or daily cost of business travel into Singapore is just over $500 per day. That currently puts Singapore as being the 19th most expensive location worldwide and the second most expensive location in Asia. And globally, that puts Singapore up from 31st, which was the position it occupied in 2021. And actually, it didn't change that much over the previous year. So we actually have seen quite a significant increase between 2021 and 2022. And that also means that Singapore goes from being the third most expensive location in Asia to being the second most expensive location in the region.
Okay, so we're going to break down some of these increases in just a while. But first up, help us understand when it comes to daily rates, what is driving these costs, do you think?
So the increase that we've seen in costs in Singapore are basically twofold. One, we have seen an increase in costs of various elements associated with a business trip. And primarily what we've seen in Singapore is the increase in the cost of hotel accommodation. Now, that's a direct consequence of the end, or rather Singapore exiting the pandemic, rather the COVID-19 pandemic, earlier than other locations in the region. That really kick-started Singapore's business travel sector once again, with people using the opportunity to return to Singapore after an absence of 2 to 3 years. That increased demand, together with a shorter supply of accommodation in comparison to pre-pandemic, led to an increase in cost of accommodation. The other factor is when we're looking at costs associated with, or rather when we're looking at comparing costs across countries, we convert the costs that we collect, or rather the data that we collect, into a common currency, which is US dollars.
Mm-hmm.
So what we've also seen is as the Singapore dollar appreciated against the US dollar over the course of 2022, that meant that the Singapore dollar costs, when we converted them into US dollars, were obviously higher in comparison to the year before. So it's really partly due to accommodation costs, but also partly due to the fact that for the purpose of cross-border comparisons, we're converting something into a common currency, and the Singapore dollar is obviously stronger, or it was stronger in 2022 in comparison to the previous year.
When we talk about the rate of increase of the cost of business travel or the cost of visiting Singapore for business, to what extent are you seeing inflation affecting that growth rate?
So we have certainly seen some inflation. As I've indicated, we saw inflation in terms of hotel accommodation. We have also seen costs associated with other elements that we research as part of the daily costs that would be commonly incurred by a business traveller. And the most significant of these would possibly be meals. So when a person obviously consumes possibly their lunch, dinner and so on, the costs that a business traveller would be incurring in 2022 are higher than they were prior to the pandemic. So those are the two kind of like main inflationary factors that we've seen in Singapore: accommodation as well as meals.
Pushing Singapore to number 2 within ASEAN for most expensive city to visit for business. What beat Singapore to the most expensive location, and how did that country perform compared to the year before?
So the location in Asia, which is the most expensive city, is Hong Kong, and it actually remains Hong Kong. Hong Kong was ranked as being the most expensive business travel destination prior to and even during the COVID-19 pandemic. But while it still remains the most expensive location in the region, while we saw costs rise in Singapore between 2021 and 2022, when we did our most recent survey, costs actually fell slightly in Hong Kong. And that was primarily due to the fact that whereas Singapore reopened to the world much more sooner than Hong Kong did, Hong Kong kept a lot of COVID-19 related restrictions in effect throughout 2022, suppressing demand for travel into the city, suppressing demand for hotel accommodation, for example, and that therefore led to a slight decline in costs. So what we've actually seen is over the course of 2022 a narrowing in the cost differential between a business trip to Hong Kong and a business trip to Singapore. Now, Singapore remains slightly cheaper than Hong Kong, but the difference in terms of the daily cost for a business traveler now is only about $5 per day, meaning that Singapore is only $5 per day cheaper than Hong Kong presently is.
Help us understand where Tokyo stood in the rankings.
That's interesting. So Tokyo was previously ranked as being the second most expensive city in Asia, and it's actually been overtaken by Singapore. Now, interestingly for Tokyo, we did see inflation in costs, hotel costs, meals and so on, as global price increases that we've seen throughout the world were also manifest in Tokyo. But while the Singapore dollar appreciated against the US dollar, which contributed to Singapore's rise between 2021 and 2022, on the other side, the Japanese yen actually weakened. So although costs incurred in local currency are higher in 2022 than they were in 2021 by a measure of 5%, Tokyo still fell in the rankings because when that data was converted into US dollars, relatively speaking, in US dollar terms, a business trip to Tokyo is actually now cheaper than it was prior to the pandemic.
Lee, help us understand what the figures tell us about the rate of the increase of doing business here in Singapore, and which countries in Asia have seen higher increases comparatively.
So in comparison to Singapore, we've seen other locations witness stronger rates of growth in costs. Now, these are essentially locations which have been bedeviled by high rates of inflation over the course of 2022. So these include locations such as Laos, Sri Lanka, Pakistan. Now, Singapore is not really in danger of losing its, I suppose, its aura or its crown as being a significant business travel hub in comparison to these locations. But nonetheless, there are locations where the cost of accommodation, or rather the cost of business travel, has increased at a faster rate than it has done in Singapore. But nonetheless, it's also important to point out that while the cost of business travel to these locations has increased at a faster rate than Singapore, Singapore still remains more expensive in terms of as a business travel destination in comparison to these locations. Now, what that does also mean is that while we have seen costs increase in Singapore, we do see it catching up with the cost of business travel in comparison to Hong Kong. We don't necessarily think that that will have a detrimental impact on Singapore's appeal as a business travel destination. Just because in many cases, business travel is actually a necessity rather than a luxury. And so these are costs that companies acknowledge that they will need to bear. But what we may see is because of this higher cost of business travel, companies may scale back on the number of days that business travelers actually spend here. So rather than coming on a business trip to Singapore for an entire week, they may compress that into maybe 2 or 3 days instead.
And which location does slightly better than Singapore in terms of cost? So Singapore's number 2, Hong Kong's number 1. Who's number 3?
So Tokyo is actually the third most expensive location in the region. And then after that, we see locations in mainland China, specifically Shanghai being the most expensive city in mainland China.
All right. Help us understand the cost for business travelers heading to neighboring countries. I'm curious about the cost of business travel to Thailand in particular.
So that's interesting. What we've seen over the course of 2022 was costs for business travelers in Thailand actually did not change that much when we're looking in US dollar terms. And that's a product of two things. Firstly, again, the ongoing impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. So Thailand is a major tourist destination, and tourism demand has a significant influence on hotel costs. And given the fact that tourists largely stayed away from Thailand throughout most of 2022, that led to hotel rates remaining suppressed. Now, that may be different in 2023 as tourists and business travelers have returned to Thailand, but as of 2022, hotel costs were still relatively low in comparison to pre-pandemic. The other factor impacting Thailand was, again, the lower value of the currency. Just like we saw in the case of Tokyo, where the currency had depreciated against the US dollar. So the fact that even though some costs may have been higher in Thai baht terms in comparison to previous years, such as perhaps meals out, when converting them into US dollars, they're actually lower than they were in previous years. So that contributes to Thailand's relatively flat status in terms of the cost of business travel in comparison to previous years.
For listeners who've just tuned in, can you help us understand what this daily rate really captures in terms of costs?
So the reason why we publish this data is designed to help companies determine the costs of business travel, and also in order to help them reimburse their employees against what we consider to be reasonable expenditure that a business traveler would incur. So the items which we look at when we're coming up with the estimated total cost of a business trip would essentially be all costs that would be incurred in that destination that the person's traveling to. So this would be hotel accommodation. It would also include meals such as breakfast, lunch and dinner, transportation costs such as taxi journeys or maybe even public transportation, and maybe incidental costs such as grabbing a coffee on your way to the office in the morning, maybe going to a convenience store to get a couple of bottles of water or soft drinks throughout the day, and maybe even a beer at the end of the day afterwards when you're unwinding. So those are the typical costs that are included in our assessment.
You mentioned a couple of cities in China earlier. Broadly, how did Singapore fare in 2022 in terms of expense compared to cities in China?
So Singapore is actually significantly more expensive as a business travel destination in comparison to locations in mainland China. Mm-hmm. So while Shanghai is actually the most expensive destination for a business traveler, the costs of business travel to Shanghai are actually 30% cheaper than they are in comparison to Singapore. Now, we also survey multiple cities in China, and of the locations on which our rankings are based, the city which is the cheapest is actually Chengdu, and that actually has a cost which is approximately 50% or half the price of the typical daily cost of business travel into Singapore. So rather than being $515 per day in Singapore, a business traveler would expect to spend no more than around $260 to $270 per day in Chengdu.
These are global rankings. So when we look at the most expensive location in the world for business travelers, that would be New York, I understand it. Which countries in the US made the global top 20?
So our global top 20 is dominated by cities which are based in either North America or Europe. But North American cities actually make up a significant portion, over 30% of the top 20. So other than New York, we also have Washington, San Francisco. We also then have Los Angeles, Houston, Chicago, and Atlanta. So all 7 of those cities make up or are within the top 20 locations in terms of the most expensive locations worldwide.
Okay, and before we let you go, Lee, what do you think the study says about Singapore's position as a business hub and a MICE hub?
So, yes, Singapore has increased in its ranking. As I've mentioned, it was ranked around 30 to 31 for the 3 years of the COVID pandemic, and probably it hadn't changed that much beforehand then. That increasing in its rankings to 19 puts it within the top 20, and that indicates that, yes, it is a relatively more expensive location. Likewise, the cost differential between Hong Kong and Singapore is much less significant than it was now. But most business hubs are expensive locations for business travel. So if you look elsewhere within the top 20, locations such as New York, Hong Kong, London are all major global business destinations, all major destinations for business travel, and still they're ranked more expensive. So I don't necessarily think that this ranking would have a negative or detrimental impact on Singapore's attractiveness as a business travel destination. However, it may have an impact on Singapore's attractiveness as a tourism destination. People, when they're going for leisure travel, obviously like to get much more for their money. And so if we're looking at Singapore's position as a major tourist destination, that relatively higher cost may deter people from spending longer in Singapore when they may be stopping off en route, going somewhere else, or they may think about bypassing Singapore instead and just going to one of the Singapore's more kind of like more cost-effective neighbours for their travels instead.
Interesting insights. Please stay if you're coming to Singapore for business. There's a lot to experience. We've been looking at ECA International's latest daily rates research. They identify trends around average cost for hotel accommodation, meals, other essentials. It's research used by companies to determine expense allowances, for example, for staff undertaking business travel. And we've been talking to Lee Quane, Regional Director for Asia for ECA International. Lee, thanks so much for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for having me.
Money FM 89.3